All right. I have been fighting at the bit to get to this one. Um, I will preface this by saying there will be a lot of thinking today. You're going to have to pay attention and use your brain perhaps a little more than normal, not because I'm talking, but because the subject matter here is very contextual in the sense that in order to understand what you're looking at, you need to keep a lot of pieces in place. The chart is designed, at least I did my best to design it as a sort of map to kind of keep pieces where they belong. But this sort of text is worded in a seemingly funny way, in an unusual way. This and chapter 17, which we will get into, um, kind of tie together a very specific, almost niche image of what is happening. And even if you try to spend the time to understand what's being said, then comes the question of why it's being said and what is the function of it. And obviously, in especially the last week or so, things have gotten very interesting again around the world. And I've been watching these sorts of things for years at this point. And it just seems like every time something happens, it seems like it's slightly bigger and slightly more than last time. And it seems like the frequency with which events around the world occur get closer and closer. And as you think about that, you start to think, all right, well, at least I do, being in the position that I'm in, I think that it used to be eschatology was, almost a sort of hobby, a fun little subject to dabble in. And we'll find out whenever we get there. But then it seems to become more apparent that when we get there seems to be getting closer. And so there's a sort of accountability that seems to be sneaking up more and more about what we're talking about. And and then on the other side, you have all these discussions about these texts and what they could mean or what they don't mean, or whether or not they're fulfilled already, or future, past, present tense, what they mean, the confusing parts, people writing them off entirely. And yet, they serve a function. And what a lot of people do, I have found in my monitoring of the various discussions on these subjects, is a lot of people have a very peripheral understanding of things like eschatology, the rapture, the second coming, the Antichrist, and so on. And they will reference bits and pieces of it and then come up and string together with an entire narrative of ideas and conclusions and speculations. They know that there will be a mark of the beast, and then they just run with that. But really, in order to understand what we're looking at and to try to get a better grip of what might be coming our way, perhaps sooner than expected, we need to understand what it's actually saying, not taking bits and pieces and stringing together a fun theory to compete with other people's fun theories. What is it actually saying? And the reason it comes across as so confusing sometimes is because it's saying something very, very specific. And so when we're dealing with this subject and we're looking at the news, I think it is fine to look at the news. I don't have a problem with people trying to accuse me of paying attention. I feel like that's what we're told to do, and it was the foolish slave who did not pay attention. But on top of the fact that I don't think you can help but notice what's happening, um, just reminiscing over the fact that in the last 100 years alone, we have covered a lot of interesting events, a lot of historical events, but it seems like history is zeroing in. At first, you go to the First World War, and it seems like it's notable, it's catastrophic, but it largely is relegated to Europe. The Second World War rolls around, and it expands in scope, covering a lot more, and kind of dabbles in the Middle East incidentally. But during the Second World War, there was the event of the Holocaust, and oddly enough, following the event of the Holocaust in 1948 would be the creation of the nation-state of Israel. And then following that, you then had multiple conflicts within Israel, back and forth, and then we had the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the Gulf War, and again, the Middle East came into view more than it did before, but Israel was still relatively incidental in the grand scheme of things until recently, where all of a sudden it became not only a fixation in the news, it became the fixation of conspiracies, of causes, and of discussions all over the place. If you search the word Israel or Jerusalem 15, 20 years ago, you'd probably come up with some interesting news, maybe some theoretical dabblings here and there and references to eschatology. Today, if you search it, you will be inundated with constant articles, both present and recent and going back months and years. But they just update every few seconds now, and it seems like the fixation has come in closer. But then we have places like Iran coming in the news, and if you know any history about the country, you know that it has its roots in Persia. Even today, many will refer to themselves as Persians. And so we look at all these things and we say, okay, well, this seems significant. We seem to be zeroing in, and I would argue that the geography of the area is significant. And its inclusion and its noteworthiness in the news lately is significant. But why? A lot of people stop short, and they'll love the dabble in the speculation and say, well, this is obviously significant. Something's happening, and then they run off and create all kinds of very strange theories, and they're undisciplined in how they approach it. Because if the theory is that we are seeing the fulfillment of things spoken of in the Bible, then we ought to take more seriously what the Bible's actually saying about those things, not simply scrapbooking together various verses to try to make sense of it. It is written in context, in a structure, to keep us in our lane. And so when we look at Revelation 13 and the beast from the sea, what we are looking at is more than just a vision of something interesting, something fascinating. Before we ever get to discussing the mark of the beast and the worship of the beast and all the fun things that come with that, we have to understand what this is symbolizing. This is the visualization of a scene, and this scene played out here is the climax of man's kingdoms, the summing up of all earthly dynasties, and the conclusion of the rule of unrighteous men. Every nation of people, every nation of men, whether good or bad, small or great, short or long, all of them are reaching their conclusion here. All of Earth's nations, boundaries, and rulers have been spiraling towards this moment. Every war, political conflict, and national downfall will be concluded here, with the last display of worldly kingdoms seen here in the beast from the sea. And so when we're going to look at this, we are looking at every nation, every history, every movement, every goal, every hope and dream and conflict tying together. This is the last hurrah, as it were, of man's day. Here will end the rule of sinful men, sitting just on the cusp of the eternal kingdom of the Son of Man and Son of God. Because this kingdom precedes the millennial kingdom of Christ, there will be no avoiding, no obstructing, nor rejecting of it. This beast is the visual display of Satan's devices, plots, schemes, and lies poured into a single world-subduing government, with the man of lawlessness sitting at it as its final king. It is not ours to deny or obscure, nor is it the will of God that such an evil kingdom be prevented by the saints. On the contrary, the very purpose of its rise is to set up the last target for the Son of Man to destroy when he comes to reign himself. This kingdom is not something that we fear as though we're supposed to stop it. We understand why it is coming, and there is even a clause put in the text that we'll get to later on a different session about what the saints are supposed to do in the face of this kingdom. But there's a recurring theme that this final kingdom is inevitable. This sinful kingdom will be the last kingdom of men, and thus we should compare it to the kingdom of Christ, in which he himself will reign in righteousness. This beast is the opposite of that, and yet all the while taking the form and claiming to be the kingdom of God until such a lie is no longer sustainable. So all that to say that everything that we're going to cover here is more than just an event in history. It is the event of history. It is the conclusion of history as we know it. So with that, and with the nature of what we're looking at, and with everything happening in the news, this ought to incentivize us and to encourage us to buckle down and think very carefully. We should be disciplined in how we approach texts. We should be mature in how we approach them, and we should be diligent, because if it gets confusing, that's not an excuse to throw it off and just assume whatever will be, and I'll be fine. We are given it for a reason. We are given instruction for a reason, and we should take that seriously. So, having put on our thinking caps, let's get into it.
So, Revelation 13, verse 1, and the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast, and they worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?" And there was given to him a mouth, speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. So, what are we looking at? Well, first we have to put together the structure and the history of this beast. We went over last time how it tied into Daniel chapter 7, and now we're going to try to tie that together and now put it into an application. But first, I'd like to deal with the greatest, I would think, misconception regarding this beast, regarding the idea of the one world government and what is coming, because there is a common misconception that I see all over the place. And that idea is the idea that, well, when it shows up, maybe we look at the UN or we look at some new thing, and everybody is just in awe of this new thing and this guy, and they all follow him, and everyone just gets these blinders put over their eyes, and they just willfully go after him. There is no indication that the entire world willfully falls in line behind the beast right at the start. On the contrary, the beast and its king wage war against the world, whether through political or militaristic means. The distinct and significant nature of the beast is not that it has global unity behind it, but that no one can stand against it. Not that no one tries to. What makes it unique is not that it goes unopposed, it's that it doesn't matter that it's opposed. It's that it beats everyone. That is why the people of the earth say what they say. Who is able to wage war against him? They've already tried to, and no one can beat him. Oddly enough, what ultimately unites the world is not their love of the beast, but their hatred of God. This is what causes them to follow him to Armageddon. After all, we have the beast making his way and sending out evil, unclean spirits to gather the kings of the earth, which implies there are other kings around the earth. Kings from the east, for example, have to cross over the recently dried Euphrates to make their way to the battle. And so the rise of the beast is a contentious one. It actually has a history of rising and falling, winning and losing, with this, its final form, rising up for one more moment in the spotlight before its final descent into destruction. While it gains power and authority to subdue the nations of the world, we must keep in mind that it gains the final form of this power right as the world is being torn apart by the judgments of God unleashed during the day of the Lord. In other words, there never appears to be any true sense of utopian global unity. Peace and safety are but mythical claims in the face of a world which knows such a claim to be intrinsically false, as there can exist no true peace and safety apart from the true Christ, whom the world ardently rejects as they follow after the false Christ. As soon as the man of lawlessness sees his day, so too will begin the day of the Lord. In other words, at no point is there this utopia. It's never all well and good with them. The theme of the beast and his reign is constant conflict and contention, both in him subduing the nations, but also God subduing the world. So to understand the history and practical meaning of the beast, and to understand the events which will occur to and around the beast, we must, again, look at the various parts which make it up, the various pieces that are being described. So, we'll start with the horns. The kings that are seen, these are representation of kings. This is why they have diadems on the horns, and diadems and crowns, these would be synonymous terms. While often compared to monarchy and royalty, a king here could also depict any kind of ruler who sits at the top of a nation, whether that's a king, president, prime minister, supreme leader, etc. It can be anyone. Basically, it is someone who is the figurehead, the person seen at the top of that nation. In effect, the horn represents an individual who sits as the effective ruler of that nation, whether by himself or joined by others. For example, in Daniel 8, there's a vision of a ram with two horns, and Daniel is told that that ram represents the kings of the Medes and the Persians. And historically, the Medes and the Persians were technically two nations, but they were really one, the Persian kingdom, and the Persians were the primary rulers. That's why one horn was shorter than the other. And so it had two kings, the kings of the Medes and the kings of the Persians, but really it was just one whole thing. So the idea being that a horn represents an individual king. In its final form, there will be 10 horns, with a mysterious 11th horn rising up from among them, which is seen in Daniel 7. And that horn is called the little horn in Daniel 8, also known as the man of lawlessness or the king of the north. And so the horns represent individual kings. We've gone over this before, but it bears repeating because of what we're going to get into. Next, we have the heads. The head represents primarily a kingdom. It is meant to indicate a kingdom or a nation from which the horn arises or over which the horn is a ruler. So you have at the top the ruler, the individual. So for example, you would have the president would be a horn and the head would be, you could say, a state or the country, depending on how it's formed up. However, the head is not strictly limited to just a nation because it carries with it another idea. Because if you look in the actual wording, there's a reason why it says in chapter 17 that the head is a king. It seems at first redundant that you have the horn who is a king, but then the head is also a king, and we have 7 of them and then 10. So which is it? And that is because the idea here of the head is that it can also speak of the king as an individual, but what makes the head distinct from the horn is that the head represents more than just the individual ruler. It encompasses what would be more akin to his dynasty, which is often tied to an individual and his family, but also includes his kingdom. So in other words, you have as the head a nation or a kingdom that is tied around a person or a family of people, and then the horn is whichever person that's in view. And so that's where you could then say, all right, well, a head is technically a nation, but it is perhaps better described as an empire or a dynasty, something with significant authority tied around individuals. It encompasses what would be akin to a dynasty, and in this context, we know that the 10 horns represent 10 future kings, which we'll get into in chapter 17 in a second. And another horn will rise up as the final king who sits as the head of the beast. As such, the head represents the very kingdom itself of the king who rules over it. So these are tied together. The head is the kingdom, and as it were, the king itself is invested heavily in this. So falls the head, falls the king. And then finally, we have the whole beast. This beast represents both a collection of nations, but is also a single nation at the same time. What appears as a paradox should make more sense when we get into chapter 17. And as we also covered last time, the beast himself may also be the visual demonstration of the demonic forces which control the nations in view. In other words, when the last time we looked, it was the spirit of Antichrist, and now we look at the glove which the hand is controlling. So first we see the spiritual powers behind it, the principalities, and now we're looking at what it looks like on the ground. Then we have the history of the beast as seen by Daniel. Now this is where it gets particular. This is where we're going to get specific. So if you read Daniel 7 and then you read Revelation 13, you'll notice there are some apparent discrepancies between the two. Because here we're seeing one beast with all these different descriptions. He is seen as a lion and a bear and a leopard, and he has 10 horns, and he's going to rule the nations. But then if we go back and we look at Daniel 7, we don't see one beast, we see 4 beasts. Now, we've talked about them being incorporated together, but there's still that distinction. It's easy to understand that there were 3 prior kingdoms, but this 4th one, Daniel notices as being unusual. It's an odd thing that he sees. And so Daniel sees the beast at a point prior to the integration of the 3 beasts, the lion, the bear, and the leopard. So in other words, he's seeing it before this point. He's seeing the beast before it had gathered everything together. He also witnesses the final conclusion of the 4th beast when it is defeated by the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. But the initial introduction is earlier than when John sees the same beast. So, in other words, the difference between Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 is timing. They both end the same way, so we know they're talking about the same thing, but the span of time that they're looking at, John is looking at in a shorter period of time. And so in Daniel, the beast is seen as separated from the others and is referred to as the fourth beast. This is important as it will give us insight into the nature of the three other beasts. These three other beasts, as Daniel was told, these are kingdoms that existed, or at the very least were recognizable in Daniel's time, each being given a likeness which we can understand. We've gone over that before. We recognize what a lion looks like and a leopard and a bear. However, it also gives us insight into the fourth beast, inasmuch as it had no likeness given to it. It is not compared to an animal at all, but is rather referred to in a generalized form as a wild beast, but also one with a distinctly more terrifying appearance than the others. This lets us know that this nation, the fourth beast, is unlike any of the others before it, being very unique, particularly in its terrifying power, along with the fact that it will be present in the time and in power at the time of the Son of Man's return. So in other words, what makes this fourth beast unique is both it's very different. It's unlike any kingdom that has existed before it. It is unprecedented. It is also terrifying in appearance, so it is scarier than any nation that's existed before it. And also, the final unique quality of it is that it will be destroyed by the Son of Man and not another kingdom. This gives us further insight into the beast, that it has a source nation from which it comes. In other words, it doesn't just pop up out of the blue. It's not suddenly there. It comes from a nation that already exists. After all, the fourth beast begins as separate from the others, tramples them down, and then incorporates them into itself. So, that seems simple enough, but complicated enough, that things represent one thing, but also another thing, and we have a beast that's distinct from the others and is a nation, but will become a different one. It seems a bit odd, so let's see if we can tie it together. I've discussed before that Revelation is broken down into different segments. Revelation is not one continuous flow of chronological events. Chapter 1 begins with the introduction of the letter and the purpose of it and who's writing it and why. Chapters 2 through 3 are the letters given to the 7 churches. Then, from chapter 4 all the way to chapter 11, we have a sequence of chronological events, starting in heaven with the Father on the throne, going down to the Lamb appearing in chapter 5, the 7 seals being broken, followed by the events with the 144,000, the 7 trumpets, and so on. And then we stop at chapter 11 right before Christ returns. Then we go into chapter 12, and we carry from chapter 12 all the way to chapter 18 a change. Some of it is chronological. However, the purpose of chapters 12 through 18 is, the best way I could think of describing it is that it is giving us a target list, a hit list. Because we've gone from chronological events to now describing subjects or characters, in this case, the antagonists that will be discussed and targeted. So in chapter 12, the first antagonist, the first target, is the dragon. In chapter 13, it's the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth. In chapter 14, it's the worshippers of the beast. In chapter 15, the bowls of wrath are being prepared for the beast and his worshippers. In chapter 16, those bowls are then poured out, which causes then the nations to be gathered for Armageddon. So there's the final event of the antagonist, that they surround Jerusalem. Then in chapter 17, we again pull back and look at another character, which is the woman who rides the beast. And then finally in chapter 18, it is Babylon, the great city. And so each of these chapters are giving us descriptions of who it is that is being targeted, which begs the question, who's targeting? This would be God. This is his day. And as easy as it is to get lost in some sort of intimidation about looking at these antagonists and seeing how bad and terrifying they are, really, that's not the purpose of them. What it's doing is it's describing to you who it is that God is going to destroy. And so each of these chapters, 12 through 18, break down that target list. So with that in mind, we've already looked at chapter 12. We looked at the dragon. We looked at his history, where he comes from, and why he's doing what he's doing. Now we're looking at the first beast in chapter 13, the beast from the sea. But we can get a better understanding of this beast. because this beast is referenced again in chapter 17. He's not the main subject anymore, the woman is. But we are given a little more detail to understand him. Because the focus of chapter 17 is primarily the woman who rides the beast. This also gives us insight into religion at the time in the future. However, we are given more insight into the beast itself, which we can use to better understand what we're looking at here. So, let's start with one of the more confusing descriptions in Revelation. In Revelation 17, which we'll read in a minute here, it specifically describes the beast as being one of the 7 heads, but is also an 8th. It's one of those verses that you read, that he was and he is not and he is to come, and the world marvels that he was and is not and is coming. And the beast himself is one of the 7, but is also an 8th. And that's one of those, how confusing, we kind of laugh and we move on. But what does it mean? So, first, to understand this, we have to understand what a head represents. If the beast is one of the 7 heads, but is also an 8th, then begs the question, what is the head representing? Again, it is a nation, a kingdom, or a dynasty. More specifically, because this doesn't narrow it down, all right, a nation, a kingdom, all right, a dynasty, or an empire, but which one? There have been plenty of them. There have been dynasties throughout history. So we need to get even more specific. We need to zoom in even more on this question. We need to understand what kind of kingdom or empire it is. It must represent something more than just any kingdom, as there have been thousands of various kingdoms and governments and leaders of them throughout the history of the world. So something about these heads makes them unique. Something about the 7 heads that are on this beast stand out. They're not just any kingdom or empire. So how do we understand them? Well, we can go all the way back to Daniel chapter 2. And in Daniel chapter 2, it's more than just a interesting story where Daniel proceeds to describe to the king his vision. This is early on when the king has a dream and Nebuchadnezzar is confused and conflicted, and he calls together all the prophets and the experts and asks them to explain it, and none of them are able to, and they're afraid. And finally Daniel, who had already interpreted dreams or was known to be good at it, gets pulled out, and he is given the interpretation, and so he explains it. But something else is interesting about this chapter. This is the first time this sort of vision is ever seen. This is the first time we're ever really given any clear insight into where the nations are going. We're given any insight into future history of the world's governments. And so in Daniel chapter 2, starting at verse 31, he gives the answer. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. And again, it's easy to read that and think, all right, it was a tall statue. But again, the wording here is that it is a massive statue. This is huge. What Nebuchadnezzar is looking at in this dream is a very, very large statue. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. After you, there will arise another kingdom, inferior to you, and then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so, like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. But It will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and some of it brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future, so the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. It's the first insight we are given into coming history. So, being that this is the first time this vision is seen, specifically pertaining to future kingdoms and insight into the final kingdom of men before the kingdom of God arrives, this will set the parameters. This is the first time we're seeing this sort of vision, and this sets some of the expectations for us as to who it's talking about. So what's the key distinction? What makes each of these materials different from any other kingdom of the earth? Because Babylon wasn't the only kingdom at the time. Persia and the Medes were not the only kingdoms at the time. After they arose, we had the Greeks and the Romans, and after them we had others. And through each of these, there were other kingdoms on the earth. So how do we distinguish them? The distinction is set in verse 38. What makes these materials distinct is given because, again, Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold, is setting the tone for the rest of them. And it is said of him that wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, any inhabited place or known place of the earth, God has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all. In other words, this kingdom, any of the kingdom on the statue, in some way or another, is over the world, inasmuch as the world cannot depose it or present any meaningful alternative kingdom. This kingdom is one which effectively rules the known world. So that's the start of the parameters. So this can't be just any kingdom. It has to be one that has a sort of global reach. That's why I started using the word empire. It's more than just a local nation. It's more than one that's just powerful. It needs to exercise its authority and its will over the other nations. Even if it's not technically their king, it is in effect their effective ruler. However, there's another qualifier, because Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was generally unopposed. He was able to beat virtually everybody. But there's another qualifier added. Inasmuch as each of the subsequent materials of the statue degrade in quality, so too does the effectiveness of the kingdom itself. None of them will reign as effectively nor as thoroughly as Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. And so that's why on the chart we have that gradient towards the bottom. We start with the gold and we progressively decline, because gold is being described as the best. This is the height of man's kingdom as far as its effectiveness and its rule. God gave Nebuchadnezzar control over basically everybody and everything. That was it. That was as peak as it was ever going to get. Every global empire that has fallen since gets worse and worse. Not that it gets smaller. Plenty have gotten bigger than Babylon did, but that they're not as effective in their rule. They're not of the same quality. They degrade as time goes on, to the extent that by the time we get to the last one, it's two materials. It's almost like the iron has holes in it and they've patched it up with clay, and it's there. It technically forms what looks like a foot and some toes, but it's not naturally holding itself together. And so we see that at the very end of the statue, at the last part of the kingdom of men, it is visualized as the feet and toes, and yet it is intrinsically divided, barely holding itself together, and when it does hold itself together, it does so unnaturally. This would indicate the reasoning of why the description of the beast is, in part, its powerfulness with which it enforces its authority, In other words, the reason it needs to be described as one which tramples down the others and beats them down and controls everyone, why the mark of the beast even shows up, is because it's not naturally held together, because people don't naturally fall in line. It is a divided kingdom. It has to force everybody into line. Another important note that helps us distinguish even more is that the heads of the beasts have blasphemous names. This is important as it provides another distinct characteristic of the kingdoms which populate the beast. These have titles which are contrary to God. And when it talks about something being blasphemy, it can really mean one of two different things. Often we think of just cursing God, and it could imply that, but there's another way to blaspheme God. Some of the greatest blasphemy against God is done by those who do evil in his name, claiming to be for God while opposing what he said and who he is. Perverted versions of God and his word permeate many nations throughout history. And in case you need a demonstration of this, Nebuchadnezzar was given all of these things. He was given complete rule and totalitarian authority over the nations and the animals in them. And what did he do at the peak of that authority? He goes out, he looks over it and says, I did this. And what happens to him? God takes away his mind and he goes out into the field and eats like an animal. He lives as an animal. God took away his, as it were, his dignity and threw him out into the wild for a while until he finally came around and realized that it was God who gave him this authority. And so that claim that I have done these things, that this is mine, is inherently blasphemous, because if God is the one who gives over the rule and the ruler claims that he gave it to himself, that is inherently blasphemous. But once understood, once we know that what makes these heads distinct is both the extent of their rule and also the fact that it is a degrading quality over each of the heads, and then finally that they have blasphemous names, that these will take credit for their own rule. Now we can start to get an understanding of what we're looking at with the heads. So now we can go to one of the more confusing parts said in the Bible. Go to chapter 17 of Revelation. Now we can dabble into this one. So again, to reiterate, the horn is an individual leader. The head represents both the kingdom and, as it were, the king. At the height of this, it's tied together. He is the visualization of that kingdom. These kingdoms are ones that have a global authority at some point. They have blasphemous titles given to themselves within that rule, and they also degrade over time in their quality. So, chapter 17, we get a vision. And this one is multi-pronged. We've got a lot to discuss with it. We'll kind of fly through it here to give the idea. Then one of the 7 angels who held the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a cup full of abominations and of unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. And the angel said to me, Why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, they will wonder when they see the beast, that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast, which was and is not, is himself also an eighth, and is one of the seven, and he goes to destruction. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they gave their power and authority to the beast. So, I'm sure you're thinking, well, that all makes perfect sense. Move on. But we'll try to tie it together a little better. So, we have 7 heads on the beast. 5 of them have fallen. The wording here indicates clearly that these are 5 kingdoms and the nations tied to them. Again, the word king, the word used for kings or kingdoms can be either or, depending on the context that's being discussed here. And so it indicates these are 5 kings and their nations, which at the time of John's writing had already gone away. This means that the beast is made up in part of 5 empires which had a powerful kingdom at some point in history, akin to, but lesser than, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom of Babylon. So its history, 5 of the nations that built it up by the time John's writing this had come and gone. The first one had its power, the second its power, and so on, and each of them fell. So, if you go back to Daniel 7, you can count the number of heads, as we've done before. You have the lion, the bear, the leopard has 4 heads, and then we have the 4th beast, that's 7 heads. So it's, I think, pretty straightforward to assume that it's talking about the same thing, but in case it wasn't clear enough, one of the interesting rules that's set out is that in Daniel 2, the last kingdom, the feet with the toes and the iron and the clay, has the same fate as the beast from Daniel 7, the little horn from Daniel 8, and the king in Daniel 11, and the beast from the sea here. They are all destroyed by the exact same thing. And that would be God coming in his kingdom, specifically as it says in Daniel 7, the Son of Man. So they all have the same fate, so we can know that they're talking about the same thing. So 5 of these kingdoms have fallen. So which of those kingdoms are we talking about? Well, the first would be the lion, a single head. It is seen in Daniel 7 as having its wings plucked and being made to stand as a man while being given a human mind. This might be in reference to the event of Nebuchadnezzar, where he claimed the credit for the greatness of his kingdom, at which point God made him live as the animals until God restored his human senses. And so this may be an allusion to that as to why it is made to stand up and given a human mind, made to be given sense again. But we know that the head of the statue, the first of the kingdoms of men, will be Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. So then what follows? Well, Babylon was eventually overcome by the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. And the Medes and the Persians are interesting because while we reference them as 2, they were really 1. The Medes were more of a placeholder, the Persians were the dominant force. The Persian kingdom would eventually be led by King Cyrus the Great, who was the one who issued the decree for the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the city with the temple. And so the bear is a reference to the kingdom which came after Babylon. Likely, I would say almost certainly, the reference to the Persians, visualized as a bear in Daniel 7, standing higher on one side, a reference to the fact that the Persians carried more than the Medes. In other words, it's somewhat unbalanced in the rulers. This can be further substantiated by the reference to the Persians and their eventual downfall seen in both Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. This empire would fall at the rise of the Greeks and the reign of Alexander the Great. So when the Medes and Persians came to their power and the Persians were at the height of the world, eventually they would be overthrown. And again, Daniel references this twice. And then we have the leopard. And this one is an interesting one. I've been looking at this one for a long time, trying to figure out what exactly is in view. It is visualized uniquely from the others, because unlike the others, it has 4 heads. And it is, quote, given dominion. When Alexander the Great died, suddenly, he was in the middle of conquest. He had taken over more of the world than anyone else had before him, and at the peak of his power, he died spontaneously. No one really knows exactly why he died, but he did. This is referenced in Daniel 8. It's referenced again in Daniel 11, that you had the Medes and the Persians, and then eventually they fell because a great king would come from Greece, but at the height of his power, he would die, and his kingdom would be split into 4 parts. And so when he died suddenly, his kingdom was in fact split 4 ways. It was split amongst 4 of his generals under him, something also alluded to in Daniel 8 and 11. However, the reign of the Greeks would continue for a while, until the Romans came in and eventually conquered them. But here's where it gets interesting, and we'll get to this in a second. But why is it then, if we count the heads, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, and then 6 would be the last head of the leopard, but John references it as one that is still present. But we'll get to that in a second. After that is the fourth beast, the last head. So I've kind of adjusted my pictures as I look into this. It's the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, but all of the 10 horns are relegated to the last head. They are not distributed across them. They are on one head and one hoe only. This beast is the last beast. This is different from the rest, as we've discussed. This beast has no likeness given and is only destroyed by the coming of the Son of Man and his earthly kingdom. This is the feet with the 10 toes. This is the beast from the sea. This is referenced both in Daniel 8, alluded to in Daniel 9, and described in detail in Daniel 11 and 12. This limits its fulfillment to the end. This fourth beast, this last head, has to be future. It has to be something that hasn't happened yet. So we can count the heads and determine that 5 of the 7 had fallen by the time John was seeing this, and we can safely conclude that the Babylonians, the Persian Empire, and the Greek had all fallen from global dominance by the time John was arrived. However, we have another one. So 5 have fallen. So when you're looking at the beast and the structure on this chart, it's giving you a history. It's not just giving you a visual description. You can actually look through and see how this beast has risen up through history. And so 5 of them are past tense, but one of them is active. One of them is. This begs the question, present from whose point of view? Is it the time of John's life? Or is it the future where John was transported to see these things? Because John was alive during the reign of the Roman Empire. He's sitting on the island of Patmos as he's writing this. So does he mean one is now, which would be Rome? Or does he mean that after he's been transported in the spirit all the way to the future, is he being told that one is by an angel in the future? This is an interesting discussion. You can go one of two ways with this one. It is potentially a reference to the time of John's writing, as the last head is still yet to come. This limits the head, which was in reference to the one which is present. So if we count the number of heads and we have 5 fallen, 1 is active, and we're asking, right, which one is that at? It may very well be at the time of John, which would relegate it to Rome. And that's interesting because Rome is in Greece. Kind of. You need only look at some of the language that John and Paul wrote with to see this gets interesting. Because if Rome conquered Greece, and the last of the 4 heads appeared to be Greek, but Rome is conquering it, well then how does this fit? What language did Paul and John and the other New Testament authors write in? It's Greek. In fact, Greek was the dominant language of the day. In fact, Greek influence had so permeated the Roman Empire that a poet named Horace said, quote, "Captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror." In other words, while Rome technically was the empire, a lot of Rome was actually Greek. On top of this, the wording of Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 would indicate that the last king, the man of lawlessness, is in some way descended from one of the 4 Greek kingdoms, though he seems to be different from them. However, it is also possible that it is in reference to the future, that there is a sort of revival of the last head of the leopard. In other words, for some reason or another, Greece will come into a more prominent place. And while that may sound silly, what kind of country is Greece today? It also sounded silly to say that Israel would return as a nation as well, so anything's possible. Either way, this is not the fixation of this chapter. 5 have fallen. 1 is, whether that was Rome or something that's going to come, because even if it is coming, it's going to be very temporary. But what's unique about these heads at the time John is looking at the beast, when we look at this and we say, all right, well, why are they mentioned? Because they aren't the main figure anymore. This is giving us background. This is giving us insight into the history of the beast. The main fixation here is the last head, the one that is yet to come. This is the final empire which makes up the beast. This is the head of the 4th beast in Daniel 7, having 10 horns on its head. This is the one that is said to remain a little while, which we know to be 42 months. And we know it to be a time and times and half a time in Daniel 7:25. This is seen as the feet and the toes in Daniel 2. It is destroyed by the eternal kingdom of God. Its method of destruction repeats in Daniel 2:7, where the fourth beast is destroyed. In Daniel 8 and Daniel 12, this is the main focus. This is the last kingdom. This is the feet with the toes. This is where the kingdoms of men are heading. Every conflict, every governmental dispute, every war, every conquest, and moving around of the geographical lines and where nation boundaries come and go, all of it's leading to this. This is where it's heading. In other words, the empire of the beast is going to start as one of the seven. So now we get to that fun part. He's one of the seven, but is also an eighth. In other words, the empire of the beast begins as one of the seven, the seventh head, but it will be transformed into a global power. Again, the head represents an empire, a global governing force. So if the beast is one of the seven, it means it starts as one of the global forces, but will be transformed into an eighth. The empire of the beast begins as one of the seven, will be transformed, and it has been made up of all the previous, combining into the whole beast, thus becoming an eighth global empire. In other words, it will have a traceable history here. Another way to look at this is to remember that the heads represent kingdoms. The seventh head is the initial version of the kingdom. It doesn't necessarily go away. It's what it starts as. And so, in practicality, what does this mean? It means that we won't see, as it were, the beast with the mark of the beast and its great authority and its 42 months. We won't necessarily see it coming. It will exist, but as one of the nations kind of buried in the world. It will have authority, but not all of the authority it's going to have. It is a nation that will exist at the time, but won't be apparent as the beast at the time. In other words, one of the nations which forms the beast, one of them, is the one which will take over the world, becoming an eighth empire. It starts as a single nation and grows into the full power of the beast. Per the rules established in Daniel 2, this nation must have some control over the known world. This seventh nation has to have global influence to some extent. However, its control is divided and barely holds together. Again, we're not looking for the power of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. We're simply looking for something that can exert its will on the world, albeit with a lot of conflict. This divisiveness is ultimately brought under control, in part, when the beast is given his authority for 42 months. So to make better sense of this image, we also need to address another question. Why are the lion, the bear, and the leopard still seen? This was an interesting one to me because, all right, they're past tense. That can make sense. All right, they're kingdoms that have come and gone. But why is the beast still looking like them? Are we saying that the five have fallen, potentially the sixth, are all just past tense and they're really not relevant to us anymore? If all of these are fallen kingdoms, how are they still here? Why does the beast still have the feet of a bear, body of a leopard, and mouth of a lion? Something seemingly paradoxical is unavoidable. These nations, the lion, Babylon, bear, the Persians, and the leopard, Greece, are both past tense. They are historical kingdoms that have come and gone, but are also present tense, meaning that they're active in some way at the end time. This is how they are still seen as being part of the beast. They are no longer living heads. They no longer have their global dominance as they did before, but are nevertheless parts of the beast. These are also given an extension of life after the beast has been destroyed by the Son of Man. This is said in Daniel 7, where the Son of Man comes with his kingdom. He overthrows the fourth beast, destroys it in its entirety, but the others, the lion, the bear, and the leopard, are allowed to live a little while longer. In other words, they are given an extension of life to go into the kingdom to some extent. So, here's what I conclude. These prior empires, the lion, the bear, and the leopard, will be around in the last days, though no longer as empires. Perhaps as nation-states, similar to Israel's current form, but not with the power they had before. Babylon will not rule the world, Persia will not rule the world, and Greece will not rule the world. It is possible, here's where I think we get to have a little fun with this, All right, the feet are the bear, the body's the leopard. We could try to speculate as to why those are the parts. Maybe the feet of the bear is representative of how it mobilizes, and the body is the biggest part. I don't really have a good answer to any of those, except one. The mouth of the lion. This is possible that the lion's mouth is a specific reference to Babylon, because Babylon will show up again in Revelation. As I said in chapter 18, who is the target in chapter 18? It is the great city called Babylon. And so, perhaps it is the mouth, in that this is the capital of the empire. This is the capital of the one world government. This is where the king, as it were, dwells and where it speaks from. Therefore, we also see the historical reach and influences of the demonic forces, because this beast, and we'll cover this when we get to chapter 17, but the beast is in the abyss, and he comes out of the abyss, and the abyss is referenced elsewhere in Revelation as a place where demons have been bound up. This is referenced as well in the Gospels, where the demons are begging not to be bound up in the abyss. We are told by Peter that that's where they are being bound up. And so this beast is made up of fallen empires that were controlled by spiritual forces, by principalities that have been bound up in the abyss, and now they're all coming up out of it one last time to give one last attempt. So with that being laid out, all of those technical details to be laid out, now we can start to summarize what this kingdom will look like. What does this one world government look like? This empire, the kingdom of the Antichrist, this global dominant force, the last great kingdom of humanity, the peak, as it were, of modern civilization and its control. What does it actually look like? Well, it will start off as a single nation, which has not yet been given control over all the nations, at least not to the extent that the beast has it. It likely has some sort of global influence, but it is divided and isn't naturally held together. It will have 10 horns, but these will not actually be kings at the time. It's just simply telling us where those 10 kings come from. So this beast, this initial form, will be a single government that will have some sort of global influence, but it won't really have any active kings. We know that the 10 kings who will rule the beast will come from it, but it's just not there yet. These will not actually become kings until the hour before the beast is given his authority by the dragon, and this indicates that these 10 men will sell the idea of the beast. It's fascinating to me because in chapter 17, what it's basically describing is that this beast is a sort of government conglomerate, this empire, this idea, but it's a deception that's given to the nations. These 10 guys apparently go to the nations and they pitch the idea of a new form of government, but one that is not actually ruled by any one man, but is ruled by the 10 of them. We have ideas of this already. We have things like the UN, like NATO. We had historically things like the League of Nations. And so we have all these things. We have a precedence for this. And so these 10 kings seem to sell the same idea. But then in chapter 17, we're told that it betrays the woman, it devours the woman. These 10 kings, they only have their power as kings for 1 hour. Their whole game plan is to get into, as it were, the thrones, and then immediately hand over all their power to the beast. So this is a single nation, which is eventually transformed into the beast. It just starts with some global power, but will be given the rest of it by the dragon, with 10 false leaders at the helm. This nation will be unlike any which has preceded it. It is unique in form, it is unique in power, it is unique in influence. It will bear terrifying and effective power. It is very effective at what it strives to do. This is the description Daniel gives to it. It is a terrifying beast. Some version of the 3 prior beasts will exist in its time. In other words, some version of Babylon, some version of Greece, some version of Persia will exist at the time this nation arises, but it will overpower them and incorporate them into itself. It will gain power quickly. It will subdue any and every nation which opposes it. This both indicates that it will be opposed and unstoppable simultaneously. So don't look for a nation that is just loved by everybody and everybody follows after. This is a nation which, regardless of whether or not they love it, will beat them into submission anyway. It will be like the empires before it. it will have, to some extent, a likeness. It might even compare itself to them, like Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon and the great Persian Empire and the empire of Alexander the Great. It may compare itself to these. After all, it has iron teeth, iron like the legs of iron. It has bronze claws, similar to the bronze midsection of the statue. It has similar likenesses to them, indicating it wishes to be compared to the greatest empires of history and aspires to the same control as they did. It will be given true global authority by the dragon. It will eventually, at the very last minute, be given full power. It will start as very effective, and then it will be given, as it were, the rest of the nations. But its authority will only last 42 months. So, what does that mean? It means it doesn't have it right out of the gate. Don't look for a nation that everybody follows and everybody loves who has all its authority right out of the gate. It will not be visible until it is given the authority. Just like we should not be thinking that the man of lawlessness or the person of Antichrist will be visible right out of the gate. He won't be. He will be obscured. He will be hidden. You'll have ideas, but you'll never be able to conclude. You'll have nations which will qualify, but you can never really settle on. It will be one of them, but we're not really sure which one. And so it is obscured in some way, but it is being prepared nevertheless and waiting for the devil to summon it for its last push. It will be a divided kingdom, held together poorly by conflicting material, by political, religious, and moral divides. It must be held together by force. Don't look for a unified kingdom where everyone follows. It is actually distinctly divided. It is distinctly not unified. It is still a nation, and it still kind of needs to be held together, and it still has a global effect, just it's cast to force itself to stay together. But nevertheless, once in power, this empire will subdue the earth, and there will be no one to effectively oppose it, though some will try. This sudden and undeniable surge of power and influence will make the world marvel at it. And they will marvel, they will wonder. The word that's used here is the same as when John looks at the woman. This idea is that it's massive, it's almost terrifying. They're staring at it in wonder and marvel that this is unprecedented. The world will look at this, but what they're marveling at is not that it is an achievement of human unity, it's that it's an unstoppable force. The world will almost be forced to marvel at it. They will be in awe of the power and effect of this beast, of this nation, of this empire, that it can't be stopped. That it will trample underfoot any and every nation who will try to stop it when it's in its peak. In other words, they will marvel at the beast because what's your alternative? Why wouldn't you follow it? Do you want to die? And then they ask the question, who is like the beast and who is able to wage war against it? This is the nature of the beast, that it is unstoppable. And finally, it will be characterized by blasphemy, but blasphemy of a unique sort. It is described in Revelation 17 as being full of blasphemous names. This makes sense. This actually kind of adds up, that it's not just full of curse words and people being mean or cruel to the idea of God. It's not atheism that it is permeated with. Because we understand that at this time, the earth will be filled not only with many claiming to be Christ or to have found the real Christ, but will also be the moment where the king of this empire will declare himself to be God in the temple of God. Such actions reveal that this nation is not only full of those who oppose God, but even more so of those who falsely claim to serve him, filling this nation with deception and lies. This is further illustrated by the presence of the beast from the earth, who appears as a lamb, as though it were a Christian nation, but actually speaks the words of the dragon, the devil, with such a nation enforcing and carrying out all of the authority and will of the blasphemous beast from the sea. In other words, this nation will be characterized by false Christianity, by false claims of it, of all different kinds of sorts. It will be full of them. But this is the sort of blasphemy that it will carry on. And finally, the fatal wound. This is where I love this sort of stuff, because this one was always puzzling to me. Why does the world worship the beast? Right? It's one thing to marvel at the beast. to be in awe of its unstoppable force, to look at it and say, well, you can't oppose it, so follow it. But then the tone changes. At first, they're in marvel at the beast because no one can wage war against it. But then the tone changes. And it shifts. All the way back in chapter 13. And the beast which I saw, in verse 2, was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. But then I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast, and they worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast and who is able to wage war with him? This is a different kind of awe that they have for the beast. So the thing that confused me was, all right, well, the head is wounded, and it receives a apparent fatal wound, and then it's healed, and the world marvels after it, and they marvel at first, and they worship the dragon, so they worship the devil, and then they worship the beast, not the head. They don't even appear to worship the head as far as the idea of just a single individual. We'll get on in a second. But they seem to just marvel at the entire structure, the entire thing, the dragon, the beast, and the head, everything just follows in suit. And so the beast is transformed. At first, it's one of the 7 nations. It's a global empire. It's comparable to others from before it. But then it receives a fatal wound and is healed, and this changes things. At this moment, it goes from being one of the 7 to now the final and 8. The beast as a whole comes together as one giant thing. It is one of the more fascinating, confusing portions. As one of the heads receives a fatal wound, we are not told which of the heads receives it, but based on everything we've covered, it's almost certainly the last head. So what sort of wound? What are we talking about here? It is the wound from the sword. It's a unique usage of this word, though. You can look in other places in Revelation where you have the use of the term for the sword. So, for example, anyone who opposes the beast with the sword will die by the sword. There it's describing the means of execution. It's speaking more generally of a specific kind of thing, that you would have anybody who opposes it by taking up their own swords, and they will die by being killed with the sword. But the usage of the word here is ever so slightly different. Is more than just describing the means of death. Instead, it is narrowing down to a particular event. Rather than saying fatally wounded by a sword, it is saying an event will happen where the head will appear to be killed by the sword. It's being very specific in what it's pointing to here. And we're not just looking for some swords to rise up against it. Something happens. An event shows up. The focus here is less the means and more the effect. The wound is visibly fatal, is a mortal wound, and it is not the sort of wound that one survives. The wound is specifically on the head of the beast. It is the kingdom itself which is seen to be slain, with no expectation that it can survive or return from such an event. So, what is this? To identify what is happening here, we need only look at the reason such a thing would happen to begin with. Why even do this? This can be done by introducing a single word, a word we've described before, counterfeit. So let's break it down even more. Let's look at the 2 words, sword and slain. Specifically, the fixation here on the sword is the effect. The sword kills. It's kind of like when they describe when you go to get a concealed pistol license and they talk about using a gun, and they say that the law will never view the use of a firearm as anything other than lethal force. You can never use a firearm and they'll look and say, well, you didn't mean to shoot someone. Anytime you introduce it, you mean to kill something. That's how the law looks at it. And so the same thing with the sword. The sword is emphasizing the intended effect. It is not here to wound, it is here to kill. Whoever is swinging it means to end the life of the victim. This is not swung to send a message, it is swung to end a life. This is why the sword is used against the opposition of the beast. Those who attempt to oppose it will try to kill it. Those who choose to fight the beast with the sword will have the sword used against them. They will be killed. And as for the counterfeit, I came across this very recently, and I don't know if you get excited by this, but I do. I'll read this very quickly because it should sound familiar. But in Zechariah, prior to the description in chapter 13 of the city being split in two and how to deal with the nations surrounding Israel and so on, there's a verse that's in here that should sound very familiar. In verse 7 of Zechariah 13, he says this. Actually, in verse 6, "And one will say to him, 'What are these wounds between your arms?' And then he will say, 'Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends.'" Verse 7, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man my associate, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. And then it will come about in all the land, declares the Lord, that 2 parts of it will be cut off and perish, but a third will be left." And this was fascinating, and because if you go to Matthew chapter 26, it is even said by Jesus to his disciples that they will all leave him when he is struck down, and he quotes this passage, that the shepherd will be struck down to scatter the sheep. And here it is in this verse describing the awakening of the sword to do it. Now, this part in Zechariah and the same reference in Matthew is not talking about the beast. It's talking about Christ. The Christ, the Messiah, would be struck down, the lamb would be struck down so that he would scatter the sheep. The shepherd hadn't been struck down. So then let's look at that last word, and this is what we'll end with. Slain. And this is where grammar can be a very, 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 very useful tool. As though it weren't clear already, we can look into Revelation itself and see what is happening here. The same underlying word for slain is used of 2 primary characters in Revelation. There are 2 characters who are described with the word slain. Here we have the head of the beast. He appears as slain. Who's the other character who appears as slain? The Lamb, who is standing before the throne in chapter 5, a lamb standing as if slain. However, there is a slight difference in the wording here. There is a distinct difference between the exact word used. While it is the same root word, the actual word is slightly different. For the lamb, the grammar indicates that the lamb's death was completed. He was dead, having been effectively slain. He was standing as one who had been killed. It was done. Thus was the paradox. You had a dead lamb standing alive. But the wording for there as having been slain, he was killed. It had happened. The head of the beast, however, appears to have been slain. In other words, we are looking at the difference between the lamb who was slain and the head of the beast, which looks like it was slain. The wording is actually being very specific that the head goes out of its way. It uses the sword, the idea of intent of lethal force, to make itself look like it was undeniably killed. The means indicate it's supposed to be killed. Whoever's doing it wants to kill it, and it looks like it's been killed. But the language gives away what's happening here. It's a fake. It doesn't actually happen. Why would you do that? Why would you want it to do that? And so what is the head that's being killed here? Well, it's more than just the kingdom. It is the kingdom that itself is tied to one particular man, who we'll get into next time. That man who rises up, you have the 10 kings and they give their authority to the beast, but then out from among them arises another one, another man. And he becomes the figurehead, the embodiment, the personification of the earth, on the earth of the beast. The kingdom itself embodied in one man. He is both the horn, the 11th horn, and the head. He is everything that this kingdom is tied into. And so, we see that the spirit of Antichrist, the counterfeit Christ, the vicar, the replacement, the substitute Christ, coming into its final form. We are now zeroing in on the specific events which will lead to the beginning of the day of the Lord. So, first, there will arise a nation unlike any before it. Then, it will begin to form a new government, but done in secret. 10 leaders will be assigned whose sole purpose is to give all of their authority to this new empire. Then a man will begin to rise up through the ranks, but also in secret. He is an 11th ruler who pushes out 3 others to make his way to the top. He will become the figurehead of this new empire. But he will suddenly be attacked and appear to be killed, and thus the nation with him. This wound will otherwise be fatal,
with no hope of recovery. It would be something no one could survive from. In an apparent miracle, he will be brought back to life, and in doing so, he will make his way to the temple of God in Jerusalem with the nations following after him and his new empire. They will follow after the beast, being in awe of what's just happened. They will be in awe of the fact that this kingdom, this empire, was like the ones of old. It was not active, but now it has come back to life, as has its head, this man who appears now to be Christ in the flesh. And there, in the temple of God, he will sit himself and declare himself to be God. And why wouldn't he? He has done everything that Christ has done. So now he sits and declares himself to be. He will declare himself, as it were, to be the lamb that was slain and now lives. Again, this imagery is now copying itself, because notice the terminology here. They marvel at the beast that he was and is not and is to come. Here is a man who, having been slain, is still alive. He has a kingdom that is ruling over the earth. He subdues the nation under himself. This should all sound familiar, because the lamb who was slain, who is Christ, he describes himself in chapter 1 to John by saying, I was dead and I am alive forevermore, the one who was and who is to come. This is a counterfeit that's manifesting here. However, there's a unique characteristic. He will not save Israel, nor has he any desire to do so. He is a false shepherd. He is a foolish and abusive shepherd. And he will do the will of his father, who is the devil. And what was the goal of the devil in the previous chapter? What was he trying to do? Destroy the woman, which is Israel. And we're told that when he can't get to her, he decides that his next target is the others who keep the testimony of Christ. And so he goes, calls up the beast, performs all of these acts, and now we get to Zechariah, where the city is surrounded. 2/3 of it will fall. This man does not wish to save the woman. And so we have the parallels. This is a counterfeit lamb. It is a counterfeit death. It is a counterfeit resurrection. The counterfeit eternal, that is, it was and is not and is to come. This is the counterfeit kingdom, so he even has his own kingdom. This is the counterfeit king of the earth. And his purpose will be to remove Israel, under the guise that they are not God's people and that they are replaced and thus worthy of destruction and removal. The wild branch, having become arrogant towards the natural branch, will rally behind this false Christ and fulfill the event called the apostasy. And when the true God opens up the sky and reveals the true Lamb and he who sits on the throne, as the true Lamb breaks the seventh seal and the day of his wrath comes, the world will fall behind the beast to war against the Lamb and will attempt to destroy Israel, those who the Lamb is coming to redeem. As I've said time and again, this is the purpose of these events, to save Israel. This the natural branch will be grafted in, all Israel will be saved when they look on him whom they have pierced. And so we'll cover the man next time. The mouth that comes up uttering great boasts, the little horn, the man of lawlessness, the king of the north. You can see what's happening. We're zeroing in. We start with the grand scheme of the devil in chapter 12. We zero in what he's trying to do. We now come to the beast. We then zoom in on the head of the beast, what happens to it, and now we're making our way down to the individual. And what is his mission? Why is he doing what he's doing? Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for this insight into not only what's coming, but that we get to see the big picture of why it is coming. That we're not given these visions of these things, an insight into the opposition so that we can be intimidated, but so that we can see that they are falling into your plan, into your will, that which has been decreed for thousands of years. They are falling right into line with it, and that we know their outcome. We know their fate. And then we know that even though the beast will appear as unstoppable, it will be stopped. And we're grateful that it's not by us, and that it's not by our will or our intentions. It is done by you when you come. And so we thank you, Father, for all of this clarity and the hope that we are given in the future, that even at the height of the world's sin, it is inherently divided and hopeless. We thank you for all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.